Like I had some rough, probably from 25 to 33, really, really rough, alone, Montana, trying to figure out how to be an adult man, try not to have, I didn't want a relationship because I wasn't ready to be married. I didn't want to have kids at that point because I didn't have a job. I remember sitting at like 28 years old, sitting in my house, and I called my dad and I was like, hey man, how'd you do it? And he was like, what? I'm like, man, you had a house, 2 kids, a job, property. I'm renting a room in Dillon, Montana at 28, like scraping by. He's only like 20 years older than me.
So before we get started, leadership quote. So this is my favorite part of the podcast, gentlemen. I love doing leadership quotes. Success is neither magical nor mysterious. Success is the natural consequence of constantly applying basic fundamentals. Does that make sense?
I like it.
And that ties back into a couple episodes ago when we were talking about what makes good leadership, right?
Mm-hmm.
Applying basic fundamentals.
Yeah.
Success.
I'm listening to the audio book, The One Thing right now. I got like an hour left, I think, of it. And it's all about breaking it down to the very basic requirement of the one thing.
Yeah. Very, very good. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this. I'm gonna go ahead and get this started. So after we received this topic from one of our followers who posed this question to us, I went to my workplace and I asked a couple individuals what they thought about it, right? And their thing, especially among men, is that we as first responders think that showing emotion or seeking help or having an issue with traumatic experiences is somehow a weakness, and we treat each other as such, right? So, and there's some truth to that. When a bro comes to me and is like, oh man, I'm hurting, the first thing I do is start joking around with him and try to make light of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
In that aspect, it can also cause people who are having serious issues not to come forward because they don't want to, have that banter back and forth. It creates a toxic environment to have that open dialogue.
I totally understand and agree. And that kind of, well, here's a good example. Like when you're doing preseason PT training, nobody wants to be the last person. And if
Right.
you're hurting that day, or if you're hurt and you're like second from the last, you don't even want to be second. You don't even want to be close to the bad guy. But sometimes, because you get raws, you get hazed forward, you yell out, push it, push it, push it. That kind of fosters right there. I started thinking about when this start to build and be part of a program. Sometimes it starts right when a person gets hired. They've never hiked before. So I think the wording, how we treat people and talk to them, like you said, like the dialogue that we promote, it to us, we're just so used to giving each other, a poke here and there, a joke. But for somebody new, it might offend them, or it might make them want to quit, or you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I agree with you, and I'm going to take that one step further, and with with a couple examples. A couple years ago, I responded to an incident that was fairly traumatic, and leaving after we left that incident, there was an individual who took some time off for mental health, right? And the first thing that everybody did was start talking shit saying, "Oh, well, maybe he shouldn't," because he held a EMT card. Well, maybe he shouldn't be an EMT if he can't handle, a little, blood or gore or whatever, right? And we talk shit for like a week because the guy took a week off, right? And hindsight's 2020, right? Like, um, he's he moved on. He moved into a different agency, and he's working for somebody else, doing fine, doing great. But looking back on how I myself handled it is exactly what our friend was reaching out about, right? Like, why are we, I struggle with mental health, right? And why am I going and talking shit about someone who, because they want to take a few days off to recover from that traumatic experience, right? Because I felt at the time that he was taking advantage of a system that we had set in place, and it wasn't that great of a traumatic experience for me at the time because
Mhm.
I've seen, you know, I've seen worse, done worse. And what I failed to realize was that my acting like that caused the people around me not to be comfortable coming to me with issues, right? And that's the toxic environment that we're talking about, right? So when she sent me that, I was all oof, like that's
It
right in the gut.
gets me right here. I
Yeah, I'm
get
like,
that.
man, I'm a I'm a I'm a piece of shit, right?
Yeah.
and and regardless, so having this conversation with my guys at work the other day, um, because they were defending their actions, right? Saying, well, these individuals were taking advantage of the system and they were doing this. And I said, I understand that's how we feel, but regardless of how we feel about it, like internally, we still need to create an environment where it's safe for people to do that because one of these times the person who really needs it isn't going to do it because all they see is us shit talking, right? So
There's one perspective to think about in that regard. So, or two things I want to just say. One, sometimes the traumatic event that pushes you over the edge of like, okay, I really need to take a break. I'm get overwhelmed now, may not be an intense one, right?
no, absolutely, yeah.
So it may look like you're trying to take advantage or be a bitch, but the reality is that's that one thing that built up and they've got like it coming from three different directions. They've been dealing with it for 5 years and haven't addressed it. Now all of a sudden somebody yelled at him and it caught him off guard and now they're traumatized. And then the second part to that I wanted to mention was like actually more of a conversational point. So is there anything to expand on that one before I say anything? That's
No,
just one way to think about it.
no, it's weird for me, right? Because I know this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like, and there I was,
Doing
this
it.
was a couple years ago. There I was being that guy that's creating that toxic work environment, right? And creating a place that what I is exactly what I'm trying to fight against today. You know what I mean? So that it's hard for me to almost justify having these conversations because I'm like, man, I was that guy, right? Being the guy who's creating that environment. So
I think it's
I
it's
don't know.
better, not necessarily better, but it's good that you've been on both sides of this. I'm sure we've all been on both sides of this topic. So it's good to have perspective and
I
give
know
give
I
other
have.
people perspective from both sides of the topic as far as like being the one to diminish this environment and being the one that is feeling uncomfortable talking about that because of that diminished environment.
Yeah, and I
Um,
know. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just to say also it's important to point out that like trauma is trauma and like everybody responds to it differently. So, what may be a traumatic experience for me may not be a traumatic experience for you. And so it's really easy to say, like, oh, he's just being a bitch. Or, he needs to just like, you know, toughen up and deal with it. When in reality, like the trauma that you deal with, it's the same feeling for him. It's just a different, it's just a different source of the trauma. But trauma is trauma. Everybody has some kind of trauma. I feel like trauma is getting talked about so much in social media right now that it might be getting like watered down a little bit, um, in the sense that like everybody experiences trauma to some degree or another in their life, but it's the coping mechanisms that we develop, both positive and negative, that really weigh on our mental health and how we process it.
I know that when I brought this topic to Brian, he he went down the rabbit hole and did a bunch of research, and I'm kind of itching to get moving there and see what he found.
So with purelistic ignorance, there's some subtopics that kind of are in the category that actually promote this purelistic ignorance. And the one that I really two of them I can really commit to that I've done. The first one is it's called the false uniqueness effect, and it's comparing oneself to others, but rather than recognizing the similarities you have, you actually notice their deficiencies, and it's almost like one upping, or out GS or outranking somebody just by looking at them. And so you tend to hold yourself a little higher, stand a little straighter, and kind of look down on them in conversation or speak. That can promote some of this, where the herd's not going to speak, where all the attention's on you and your individuality. And then the next one is it's called spiral of silence. And I put a little note here on minute 13:22. We kind of had a little moment of the spiral of silence. We were trying to go forth. We all just were quiet. Like, who's next? What are we going to do? Like, people will tend to just back away and not be a part of any of the team. They'll be there presently, but they won't. Just because they don't agree doesn't mean they'll still walk the line. They'll still do the job, but mentally, they will shut down all forms of communication. That's kind of in a subtopic that could add to this big word of pluralistic ignorance. And there are some studies I read up on that they did. Basically, they did these studies with college students and drinking. Like, oh, all freshmen need to like party from Friday to Sunday, and get hammered, when really they thought that was the norm. But when they put these questionnaires out, guys were like, nah, I'd really just study and have a couple beers, but it's Friday, I gotta get going. That was one study. It was a Harvard one I saw, and I was like, oh man, that's interesting. But I've definitely been on both those spectrums where I looked at somebody and went, nah, I'm better than you, and we've all done it, especially when I was younger. I was kind of like, I can't show anybody any weakness. And so, I would puff up a little bigger and try a little harder. And then the silent part, the older I got, I was just kind of like, well, you know what? I don't even need to give these guys ain't gonna listen to me anyway. So, I'm gonna walk the line, but I'm gonna do it my way. And so I've been there. I've been a part of this whole thing. So it's not good leadership. I've recognized it, but it's also recognizing when you're doing it. I think nowadays, it doesn't matter if you're on an engine, it doesn't matter if you're on a helicopter. For me, if you're at boots on the ground, man, thanks for the help. Like, I could really use you here. I kind of promote more of the self-individual promotion. Like, those people are like pumped that I'm excited they're there. And they tend to want to work better and stay and be part of the team. So
So I don't know what it is. I'm having like the hardest time like processing this definition. So pluralistic ignorance refers to a situation. I'm reading this from a Simple Psychology article. Pluralistic ignorance refers to a situation in which virtually every member of the group privately disagrees with what are considered to be prevailing attitudes and beliefs of the group as a whole. So I don't I'm having trouble like grasping. So is it just having different opinions in the group, or is it the group has different opinion? How do
I read it as the that like because we're talking strictly about mental health, right? So
Yeah.
think about back in our Marine Corps days, right? We're standing there in formation in the platoon, and say one of the Joes speaks out. Say it was the platoon sergeant, right?
Yeah.
Speaks up and starts crying in front of the platoon and starts talking about how he wants to take the Remington retirement, or something to that effect. And we all know that that's a serious situation, but we all stand there and judge and look at him as he's weak and not a good leader because of it, and we treat him in such a way. That's how I'm interpreting that, and
Okay.
that's a little to the extreme, I think, but I'm just trying to drive that that point home.
Yeah, I had to read it a few times, like through some different. I ended up getting the most common sense direct was on Wikipedia for me, and
Yeah,
then using those references underneath, like the Wikipedia references, and I would look at them, and then on the bottom of it, and then try to like expand because it's not just one small thing. It's pretty big,
yeah,
and people have different views and opinions on it. I think in our line of work with Chris and I they can with human resources they compare it. They call it conscious bias. You know,
yeah,
they call it something different. And I was like, man, that's sounding a lot like this policy and that policy for us in our work, but overall, and it's been around for a long time. The studies like in 1962. Like, whoa, who thought of
Yeah,
that?
psychology is intense, man. I love the psychology stuff.
but but is that starting to? It's like when I don't want to.
Okay, so this paragraph, tell me. All right, this paragraph might connect some dots for me. Pluralistic ignorance occurs when a person does not agree with a certain type of thinking, but believes that everyone else adheres to it, and as a result, follows that line of thinking, even though no one believes it. Okay, so that's
Mob
reminds me
mentality.
of yes. There was a
Kevin
study
started
done
doing
in like 1970s, I think it was, where they got people to follow crowds of like inappropriate thoughts and I can't remember the study. I'd have to look it up. But it's the same reason, like why, like how are people able to do what like the Nazis did, right?
Yeah.
Like it was a
Exactly.
mass mentality that made people say, "Hey, like that's our government right now, right? Like that's our U.S. political system." Like, hey, here's a massive crowd going in this direction, doing all these things. And then you've got people over there being like, I just want somebody who's smart and makes good decisions and wants the best for everyone. And then the people they're with is following the stupid crowds.
Yeah.
They're like,
So
yeah, whatever. I don't want to say anything political.
But
so
it's
Yeah.
I wonder how much, because none of us are psychologists, obviously. But I wonder how much of it is like, you have that need for belonging. You know what I mean? Like you want to be a part of your peers. You want to be a part of this group of your peers.
It's a
And
negative side of peer pressure.
yeah, like it, I know from my moral standpoint, from my moral foundation that this is wrong, but this is what the group's doing. So like I don't want to stand out and be like the weirdo, You know what I mean? So
You know, we're talking about it with a negative connotation, but I'm not sure that it's purely a negative thing, right? It's just following the crowd going against your own beliefs from the sense of
So
what I'm getting out of it.
right. But in the question that was posed,
Yeah.
it's I believe, and I'm going to use a hot topic term here.
How
I
how
believe
was
that it's
how was the question posed? I figure actually reading it would make it easier to see it the way you saw it.
just how pluralistic ignorance, especially among men and first responders, in a group setting, no one thinks mental health is worth talking about, or they think it's weakness. But individually, they're struggling and have struggled, but don't acknowledge the seriousness around other men. So, what they're talking about, right, is textbook, and I'm going to say it, toxic masculinity. Right.
Well, let's before we throw those fancy words out there, how are you
Spicy.
interpreting that question exactly?
I'm interpreting it the
Okay.
way that in the way that amongst men, we like in a group setting, right, in a briefing room, or
I wouldn't even say it's just men though. I know a lot of women who hold those same stereotypical mentalities too.
and we'll get into that a little bit later
Yeah.
on.
Okay.
I hit him up
Because
on that.
yeah, because that's right. But it's because we have been men, especially boys, and I do it with my son too, admittedly. We got to be tough. We can't, don't show emotion, don't cry, don't show weakness. And a lot of us do that out of coping mechanisms. A lot of us do that out of survival because past childhood traumas, right? So when we're in a group setting, we don't we don't show emotion, right? Like we don't show we don't open ourselves up like a lot of women do, right? We're not emotional. We try not to be emotional beings, but we are, right? And so we hold it down inside, and when someone brings that to us, and I've been on both sides of this where someone's being overly emotional, and
Can't handle your energy.
I'm like, I don't know what to do with that emotion. That emotion right there, I don't know what to do with that. Because like I'm not, admittedly, I'm not equipped to handle those emotions because I'm just now learning how to deal with my own emotions in a healthy way, right? And that's the I feel like that's the question that's being asked, like, why is that? And I think it all starts with that one toxic leader who's like, oh, you're being a bitch, right? Or, oh, well, you're too emotional, you need to take time off because you're going through a mental health crisis or whatever. Like, I'm going to pull your quals from you. I'm going to take your gun, your badge, I'm going to take your quals, right? And like now they got to move you to another department, and all because you reached out and asked for help, right? And those are things that actually happen to people, right? And
Oh,
it's a shame that that's the environment that you know that we're creating for ourselves. And then you throw women in there, and we like they have to. I'm sorry. I'm just jump right into this women thing real quick. Uh, Women have a hard time in male dominated industries because if they do good, right? If they're well liked and they get promoted because they're smart or educated or whatever, behind closed doors, people are saying, well, they're sleeping with a boss or they got there because of their looks or whatever. If they're, type A personality and they're aggressive and assertive, we call them bitches and we say, well, they're just hard to handle or whatever, right? And then if they were to open up the way that they do and I'm sorry that I'm speaking for women on this behalf, but I had a conversation with two of them yesterday about this. And if they were to open up in a group setting the way that they do with their peer group, we would be like, well, there it is. That's a woman being overly emotional. She must be on her period, right? And I don't treat the girls I work with like that, but I can see how that could be a thing, right? And I've seen it manifest itself in different ways. So when they go through stuff, they have to almost have more armor than men do when it comes to standing side by side with us in a first responder environment.
I don't think it doesn't help also, and I don't think any of us fit in this specific category, but there is always that, I shouldn't say always, but there's oftentimes that stereotypical male in that group that is just out for women, that just says like, women don't belong here, we're not going to give her a chance, like, and I think that mentality's starting to die away, at least from my perspective. It's starting to go away a little bit as the our generation gets in, and then the next generation gets in. But like our parents' generation was really bad about that. About like, like women don't belong here. I mean, they were talking about, like, our generation in the Marine Corps was talking about women in combat roles, and that was a whole thing too. So I can see how
Well,
see how I can see
well, no,
how
you're talking about women. All right, yeah.
I'm not I don't want to open up that can right now, because that's a whole nother thing. I was just lending to the point that to Chris's point, that I can see how, um in a male dominated industry, that women have an even harder time than men do oftentimes, because of the way that we treat our emotions, essentially.
Yeah. We are in the middle of a society. I don't think I think a lot of people see it too. We are in the middle of a societal change of the way society works. I think it's a combination of the technology opening up the amount of awareness and fairness and just openness that people get, and people are exposed to much more and everything. And so I think the world right now is in the middle of like a chaotic scenario where they're trying to refigure out how society's going to go based off of old traditions and new norms that are coming in as people are trying to find a balance.
Yeah, we have a long way to go.
We do. And the thing is, but with the amount of people, I don't know if it's just because we have our own podcast and we're talking about this stuff ourselves, but I feel like everything I go and listen to now is like 100. Well, I'm probably just getting served all that on the platforms, but everyone is talking about mental health and all awareness now, and they're all coming in from their own perspectives and angles, talking about this stuff. So pluralistic ignorance. I forgot what the second word was. How do you get away from it? How do you recognize it?
It's
Because the whole point is
I
you disagree with the masses, right? So then you either have to be smart enough to recognize that your understanding is different than everyone else's,
Mhm.
or you just, I don't know, you gotta educate
So
yourself, right?
I feel like spreading awareness, right? And having a little intestinal fortitude and standing on your own 2 feet and fighting back against that. Because I've been in rooms where those conversations are being had and kept my mouth shut. And knowing that, disagreeing with it fundamentally, but not saying anything because I felt like I wasn't in the right place to be heard. right? But like now, where I'm at now, I feel like I can say what I'm feeling, right? And whether it's, hey, this is, you might not agree, but that guy does need those 2 days off for his mental health, right? Or, hey, just because we don't feel like that was a very traumatic experience doesn't mean that he's not pursuing it that way. And then educating them on what a traumatic experience is because they might not know.
Sensitivity when it comes to traumatic experiences, right? This is one thing I had. Is when I started going through my own PTSD therapy and then recognizing or seeing some scenarios while I was working in the corporate world. Like I got pulled aside once or twice for being too military-like when I talked to people and people were trying to go around me and talk to my boss about it because they didn't like that they were getting reprimanded. I honestly felt at the time that they were doing it because they were just mad they got in trouble. And they were supposed to have more experience than I did, but they were putting out less quality work. And I got pulled aside being told that I can't talk to people in certain ways because it's traumatic. Because I'm too military-esque and it's scary. And it literally all I did was like, don't you have fucking 5 years experience? Like they were preaching about it. I'm like, yeah, well, this doesn't show work of quality of people with 5 years experience. Yeah, it did not go over well. But it made me realize that the intensity of what people consider traumatic.
So the first thought that popped in my mind was like you have to have a developed moral foundation, be cognizant of if you don't have any like moral foundation, you're just gonna go with the group. Um,
Is it
and I
moral
think
though?
yeah, I think it is because you have like some of it's ideals, but to me mostly it's morals about how we treat people, how we respect people, how we converse with people and that kind of stuff. I think that all comes from a place of morality because how you want to be treated. What's the golden rule? Do unto others as they would do unto you, right?
Or
And
you
I don't
want
think
done
we
to you?
yeah, I don't think that we practice that very well in group settings, because we're always ragging on each other and that kind of stuff. And also, I think that there has to be a compromise because the people that are upset with you for calling them out when they needed to be called out are as much the problem on the other side as the person on that's being too aggressive and being too quote unquote militant about it. Because they're like you're calling them if you're calling them out because they're not doing their job, they need to be called out and they need to recognize like, okay, I'm being told I'm making a mistake and I need to, you know, recognize that at least instead of just utilizing the system to stop people from criticizing them. Because I think that's a problem too. I think people don't take criticism anymore, and any kind of criticism is considered, aggressive and um, not okay.
Yeah, I think the problem with that though, Kevin, is I myself, and I know I'm not that bad of a person, guys. I pick on myself a lot, because I see where I can improve, and
Or have improved?
there's or have improved, correct? And there has been a lot of times where instead of giving constructive criticism, I just gave criticism, right? And even when you're giving constructive criticism, there is a way to bring that to someone's attention without just being a dick about it. And I know there's people out there that would call me soft and weak and whatever. And for those people, I challenge you to come work with me for a season because it ain't like that. The you know being taking care of your folks and the people around you, physically and mentally, emotionally, isn't being weak, right? I feel like it takes a stronger person to stand up against that stigma and fight that head on than it does for someone to just, tell another person to suck it up,
Yeah.
right? Or pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You know what I mean? Or move on, right? Like that's the I feel like as a we're all roughly around the same age. I think Brian's got a few years on us.
39 for me.
Yeah, but he, you know, we're all in that age range where we're in the mix of like that old school, new school mentality, right? And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, right? If you look at the statistics, alcoholism's down, domestic abuse is down, right? And I believe that that's because people like us in our generation are speaking up more, right? We're not afraid to speak up,
To communicate.
to
It's a
communicate.
great segue into communication.
Yeah.
It's a very, so as somebody who has prevented crowds from going in a direction that everyone thought was okay, it's hard. It's hard to one because when you're bringing up the point, hey, this is not good and this is not where we're going, you're usually challenging someone's own beliefs.
Hmm.
You're challenging the things they think is entertaining or they're doing or actively trying to do because they've got an aim and they're going in that direction, right? Whether it's a group bullying somebody or a group just making a choice that isn't the best. So you have to argue. And then when you try standing up to people, one, you're going to get kicked back from the group. One, because if everyone's already got a perspective going in one direction, and this is usually why, like, especially I'll tailor it to corporate meetings because this is what I'm used to. But like when you're in a meeting and you share an opinion that's different than others, if you can get one or two people to stand up and say, "Hey, you know what? Actually, I agree with that different opinion," usually the whole crowd will change. And it tends to be the people who have the opinions that are outside the others, but getting people to see that is really, really hard because it's not just a matter of saying like, hey, I believe this is wrong, because then you get those you get those people who are not very smart and they're sharing their own opinion, which is usually ignorant in its own first place, and they're standing up and they're saying, hey, no, you're following the crowd, I'm the one who's right. So how do you communicate around? See, I think what people need to learn is the communication skills to express it, to counter it, and then to, I don't know, merit others.
Yeah, communication and education. Um, because for me, you could have communicated to me that you have depression, right? And I'm just using this as an example,
Yeah.
right? Um, and there was a long period of time where I didn't understand what that meant, right? Like I knew the textbook definition, but when someone comes to me, they're not going to be like, I have depression. Most of the time, you're going to see it in them. And then they're going to be like, man, I'm not sleeping well. I have, anxiety. And like bros just don't talk that way to each other, right? It's like, man, like what's going on? Well, man, I'm not sleeping very well. Like I can't sleep at night. Like I don't know why, but I'm having a hard time focusing on this project or on this. And like those are all like little signs of depression, right? And I didn't know those for a long time.
Yeah.
And it's not just the being able to communicate that. It's being able to have the knowledge of what those signs are and recognize those.
Why don't you think that we, because women as far as I understand, listening to the conversations that my wife has with her peer group, they talk to each other about that kind of stuff. Why don't what is it about? Is it a um hereditary is not the word. Maybe it is the word. Is it a um something that's been passed down to us? Are there men
Well,
out there that do talk to each other like that? I mean, Chris, you and I, we have some pretty good conversations,
yeah,
but
me
also
and yeah,
we've known each other for a long time too.
yeah.
So, but I know, like, you know, my wife will talk to we have we home not to go too deep here, but we homeschool our kids, and we go to a homeschool co-op, which is mostly just other moms, the dads show up when they're not working, but listening to some of the conversations that they have, like, they get really deep. And these are ladies that have only known each other for a year, 2 years, maybe 3 years max. What's different about us? You know what I mean? You know what I'm trying to say here?
I think it has two parts. One, people aren't comfortable talking about it, and two, most people don't know how to fucking deal with it, right? So it's like, hey, I want to share my emotions. Like, I'm going through some shit. I want to share my emotions. Like, what value does it have? Like, if somebody heard me, okay. Do I want to kill the buzz while everyone else is having a good time because I need to get something off my chest? Like, I'll deal with it later. Never. Oh, yeah, I didn't mention it yesterday or the last week or the last week before that. Yeah, I'll deal with it. Don't worry about it. I'll just take care of it myself. It's so much easier just to do all that than it is to just get it out there.
Is that
We're
a is that a product of us being, provide I think we're all providers as far as our family
I
unit
think it's
goes.
a I think it's a result of being a fixer,
Is
is
that
my theory.
that's yeah, I think that's what I was getting at. We're providers, we fix things, we
Solve problems.
like, it's on us to provide. So I know for me, what I struggle with is being um I guess emotionally vulnerable even to my wife, who of all the people in the world I should be able to, because in my head still, like, that's weakness. You know what I mean? Like, my family's relying on me to provide for them. If I'm dealing with this and dumping it on them, then, like, that it shows weakness. At least that's the mentality that I'm trying to change.
it's if like I don't know. I'm on social media a lot these days, an unhealthy amount, and I always stop and listen to those dudes on Facebook or Instagram that are like 5 things women hate, right? Or like, and it's like the number one thing that always pops up is like not being vulnerable or not being, you know, emotional, and it's like those are that is so wrong,
It's
right? And it's
it's pluralistic ignorance. They're
right,
spreading it. They're spreading it further.
and that's what that's what men do, right? We want to say that we're providers and we want to say that we're the ones that, we're fixers and we're this and we're that because that's what has been drilled into our heads since we were little boys. Boys will be boys, right? And boys don't cry, boys don't show emotion. And that creates us to be emotionally inept, right? Like we're just emotionally dumb. We don't
I'd
know how
argue
to.
I'd argue that there's a nature underpinning of that though. That behavior is just a natural state of what males are in the human race.
Would you like to expand on that?
So we are like, so for example, I think a perfect example of it is you see it in kids, right? So my son's 6, he loves to just smash things. I'll literally, if I need to get him outside, I'll sometimes be like, hey, let's go grab a stick and break something. Like, they'll be like, hey, you want to go play outside? He'll be like, no, I'd rather just do this. Like, let's go break something. He's like, okay. super excited about. But it's a boy thing, right? And then like people with daughters, you'll notice that they're cuddly, they're close, like they don't want to go smash things, they want to socialize and interact. I think there's a natural underpinning of human behavior that causes us to go in these spirals, and the only way out is through education. Yeah,
I
that's
agree. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I agree with what you said, because I was one of those kids. It's like I wanted to, once I smashed a stick, where I was like, let's just go out. And then once I figured I could do it by myself, just with permission of my dad when I was old enough, I didn't come in the house. I was, you know,
some sticks.
rolling boulders and jumping my bike and off stuff. I was, what my parents said I was getting out extra energy, maybe was probably just me being a boy, like highly motivated, highly probably sensitive. You know, if you yelled at me, I'd be like, what are you yelling at me for? Just high strung.
Yeah, there's so like if physical touch is like a natural humanistic requirement too for people. Like with boys, there is like an oxytocin release of some sort. I can't remember the details behind it. But that whole like pressure pushing fighting thing, like boys fighting and wrestling, is just, it's part of nature and growth together.
That's why I wrestled as a young kid. They're like, get him into wrestling. That physical contact.
Exactly. But that's my understanding of it being a natural state of who we are.
Yeah, and I hear that and I understand it. But at what point are we raising our boys to not express their emotion?
That's a huge emphasis in my house right now. So I have, like, my kid called me the other day from his mom's house and was just like, I want to play video games. And I'm like, it sounds like you really just miss me and you want to communicate with me. And he's like, oh, kind of. Like, he's like, I don't want to talk about it, but yeah. It's like, and I'm trying to get him to recognize. So that's like the number one thing I'm trying to do right now with my kid is like identify emotions, label them, and get him to understand how to express them.
Yeah, that's
right.
Yeah, and I'm working. Yeah, we're with my son. We're actually working on that too, like through, like not only at home but actually through school too, being able to identify his emotions and talk about it. And that was before we started our whole journey with the false motivation podcast.
Mhm.
Right. And I never correlated the two until you just said you're working on it with your kid. Because he is that kid that he doesn't show his emotion. He doesn't talk about his emotion. He shows it in his physical
Mhm.
being, right? Like when he's upset, he's upset, he's throwing stuff and being aggressive and doing all that, which is not, it's not okay, right? Like that's not how we need to act. And so we're trying to be like, son, like that's, you're upset. Like what do you feel? What do you feel right now? Like what do you feel inside of you? And there's times when he's spun up and I'll be like, son, stop. Do you feel that inside of you right now? And he'll be like, yeah. I'm like, okay, can you say what that is? No. I'm like, okay, well, I want you to think about it. Right. And that's trying to raise a boy, a male who is, that's what he does is be aggressive, right? To be able to identify what those are, right? It's okay to be aggressive. Just be aggressive in the right aspect, right? Be aggressive in the right direction. Just because you're upset or angry doesn't mean that it's okay to go out and break stuff, right? So I think that's a start. And I think more people are doing that. And I know that there's like grandpas and dads out there that are like, if they hear this, they're like, that's so weak. And it's like, okay.
Well, that's usually because of the mentality they grew up with too, right?
Yeah.
I think
That's what
it's
they were
interesting.
told.
I think it's interesting that this path kind of traveled towards what we're doing as parents, because the same thing that we're practicing with our kids, we can also be practicing in our peer groups and in our work environments, especially as leaders. Um, I think it's a crutch to and I'm guilty of it. I do it with my boy sometimes too. Like, you know, just telling him to stop it, or yelling at him, or he falls down and just telling him like, hey, you're fine, it's not a big deal, get up, brush it off. Like, they're like, it's there's a time and a place for, like, yeah, you need to brush it off, let's go. But also it's important, like Chris, you were saying, to guide them through that emotion and what they're feeling, and vocalize it so that you can deal with it. And I think that gets lost in the workplace, and that's why we deal with this pluralistic ignorance, is because it's a lot easier to just say, oh yeah, whatever, it is what it is, than to really say, like, well, what do you mean by that? When you say that, what do you mean? What do you mean when you say that? Why do you think this is the best way to do that? Or, whatever the situation may be. So it's interesting that this path led us towards, like, disciplining our children, and learning to communicate with our children, when those same tactics can be applied to our work environment and our environment with our peers.
Yeah. And I gotta give Brian a little bit of credit here. And he'll probably remember this story too. When I first met Brian, we were on an incident together, and I was standing up on top of a truck, and I was just throwing stuff, and I was angry about it, right? I'm just throwing stuff like off the back of my truck, and like Brian's standing there like looking up at me, and and I'm like, I was in I was in the zone, right? And I was mad about something. I don't remember what it was, but I remember him standing there and like looking up at me, and just being like, "What can we help you with, man?" And I'm like, "Grab some hose packs." And like he got his guys together and started like deploying hose, right? Which is something that they don't do, right? And like it threw me off because like what Brian does, those guys don't do that. They don't even talk to us 98% of the time, right? And then later on the same incident, weeks later, I'm down at this, station, and he comes up and he's like, "Hey, what's going on?" And like just it's just that presence of like having a kind demeanor about you, right? Like he wasn't coming at me aggressive or
Very
speaking to
welcoming.
me. He was welcoming, and I'm standing there being an asshole, right? Like, who's this little dude? And like it's that type of thing where and maybe it's because he's older and he's been doing this a lot longer than I have. Um I don't know, maybe it's part of my insecurities. I don't know, but I know that when he did that, it relaxed me to be able to actually have those conversations, right? And then we built a friendship, since then. I think that was what, 2020?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember that day quite often because I was like, man, you had some contractor guys with you that you couldn't take care of. You had a 50-acre spot, and we were just driving by.
Yeah.
And the truck in front of me, the squad in front of me was like, we don't do that stuff. That's not what we're here for. I was like, my truck pulled over. I ran into Chris. I'm like, he just said, grab a pack. And we ran up the hill, punch line with him, and then that, I think the initial, I like to say things like under stress, when you come in like, what do you want me to do? That's not going to get an answer from me. But like, hey, man, we're here to help.
Yeah.
With a small, get you a lot further in the fire world or any world. And then from then on, we just started seeing each other in incidents, building this relationship, this working relationship, outside, inside. You know, my job is basically what we do. we're not really a team player. Jumpers are individual. We're a small group. We do our stuff, we leave. Nobody knows about it. But our job is to be a fireman. And we have to be well rounded. That's how I was brought up through this system. You know, hand crew, engines, hotshot crew, smoke jumper, then up. And a lot of guys today are not going through those avenues. So if I can pass the torch to somebody, which all the guys that I had on that squad that year, they've all transferred out to beautiful pastures at different jump bases and are great firefighters or peers now. I don't like being on fires with them because they're always like, "Hey, what should I do next?" I'm like, "Hey, man, we're equals. Like, I'll ride your coattails to the end. For 24 hours. Let's just do this. It's kind of a good feeling. It makes me feel like I've actually broke through the pattern of machismo and smoke jumper. Like they were firefighters.
Yeah.
I can run Chris's engine. I know how to run the pump. But I went through that engine academy stuff and done that.
So I'm doing a lot of research on the startup I'm working on the project side, on the side as well. Called Start With Me. But the thing that I've been doing a lot of research in, which is actually, I think will give me the ability to give a name to your ability to recognize how to handle people in their emotional states. And that one, we're also all teaching to our kids as well. I think this is what we're all trying to get to, is emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And
Good
your
word.
ability to see, like Aggie's ability to see you in a stressful situation, like he knew, okay, this is the state he's in. What's going to be the most effective way to handle this situation? Say, hey, I'm here to help. What can I do? Right? That's his emotional intelligence cueing in, saying like, okay, I've seen this before. I know the best way to get something productively done. Let's do it. Right?
Yeah.
So Aggie's bringing in his maturity and his emotional intelligence.
The old gray beard.
It's interesting too because I met Aggie through Chris. We met at a taco stand in Orland.
Oh yeah.
When was that? That was
21.
21. Yeah. So like you definitely left an impression on me as far as like being inviting and like I was kind of in awe because I've done some contract dozer work. And you always hear about smoke jumpers, but you never meet smoke jumpers. So like meeting you guys and like talking to you about that, I was a little bit in awe of like kind of how almost nonchalant you were about it and how like easy it was to talk to you. And then like, a couple years later, we're doing jujitsu together and same thing. I don't know, there's just something about your character that left an impression on me that I think about from time to time as far as like I really appreciate being treated that way and I would like to be able to treat people that way when I meet them. I think emotional intelligence is
Yeah, it's not a quality that let's just say I had to learn about myself to find that quality. Like I had some rough, probably from 25 to 33, really, really rough, alone, Montana, trying to figure out how to be an adult man, try not to have, I didn't want a relationship because I wasn't ready to be married. I didn't want to have kids at that point because I didn't have a job. I remember sitting at like 28 years old, sitting in my house, and I called my dad and I was like, "Hey, man, how'd you do it?" And he was like, "What?" I'm like, "Man, you had a house, 2 kids, a job, property. I'm renting a room in Dillon, Montana at 28, like scraping by." You know, he's only like 20 years older than me. So, I mean, I was like, man, back in his life, I was like, how come this isn't working for still like living in a basement? Like, I, I had to figure it out. I had a lot of, and I just kind of walled everything off. But being a part of a team has always been part of it's what I've known from sports to fire to, well,. But those qualities that, to learn those qualities, and I had to find my avenues. And it wasn't easy. But if the job's going to be successful, it's a team success, and instead of being individual and worrying about me, I had to find the right pieces and the right players and the right avenues that will make me be more productive like that and act in that kind of realm. So jiu-jitsu is kind of like a super awesome, valve for me to like blow off some stuff that frustrates me. But then it's in a team environment, we're learning and getting better and all that kind of stuff. But I've always kind of been brought up in that kind of way with growing up as a kid, wrestling with I only had friends in sports really growing up as a kid. So not really many lived around me. So it's kind of that environment that I've always been in. So I kind of tweaked it a bit to, help advance my adulthood, I guess. I appreciate thanks for the nice words, guys.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's cool. Like it's like you pointed out. Like it's not a in the realm of nature versus nurture. Like it's not a nature thing. This is something that you had to learn through your own experiences and keeping that as a thought in your head as you're working through this stuff about learning about yourself. So for the people that are listening, like this is something you can learn. This isn't something that you're either born with or you're not. So that cop out of like, oh, that's just the way that guy is. It's just kind of a crutch that people lean on because they're not interested in bettering themselves or recognizing their own faults. You can definitely learn. You can learn these things. They can be taught.
And that's exactly why I'm studying it for the startup I'm doing, because it's going to teach people how to show up in relationships, to understand themselves. But we'll talk about that later as it gets further along. But it's kind of funny though, because I was looking at it the other day and considering what I'm doing over there in that project, what I'm doing over here with false motivation, everything I'm working around is actually all about emotional intelligence and learning and growing and understanding. And I think that's the number one perspective that I'm trying, like the number one, I don't know, the perspective is not the right word. The number one takeaway I'm trying to make sure my son gets is to know that our emotions are hard to deal with. So if you can label them, you can be better off. Or if you, at the very least, can get them out of your mouth, just to say, hey, these are the emotions I'm having right now. Like, you have no fucking idea what to do with them. And like when you're expressing them to someone else, if they have no idea what to do with them, hey, at least they're out there.
Yeah.
Even if it goes against the view of the crowd.
Yeah, it's okay to feel your emotions for sure, and it's okay to let people know that you have those emotions in the right way. I'm going to plug the Trinity Hot Shots one more time.
Okay, before we do that, I just want to make sure, did we cover everything that you wanted to cover? Did we get it out in a way that makes it listenable from somebody who has no idea what the fuck we're talking about? And is there anything else we need to cover to add to it or wrap it?
No, I feel like we rounded the corner and we've done
Sweet.
pretty good with talking about emotional maturity. So, later on though, I would like to do a response to that guy's comment about work harder and work harder to get promoted and do less overtime to spend more time with family. I do want to do. Yeah. Okay. I think I think that's it. Just for you guys to know, April 27th is the date of the Trinity Hot Shots golf tournament, and we will be sponsoring that in our own way. We are going to have Trinity Hot Shots coffee available. It'll be in the Cowboy blend. As soon as that's up and available, we will promote that pretty hard, and all the proceeds from their coffee is going to their I lost the word, going to their charity of choice, which I believe is the Wildland Firefighter Foundation, which is a good a good deal, and maybe Brian can elaborate a little bit more on what the Wildland Fire Foundation is.
Yeah, so the Wildland Firefighter Foundation was set up. First, it was a what do they call? I'm losing that word. It's a foundation set up to help support wildland firefighters that get injured, and not just injuries, but fatalities. Set up to help the families. A lot of them have wives with young children. They're kind of like the first responder prior to the government and OSHA deciding, what kind of help the families need. And so we all donate every part of even Cal Fire donates to that. And actually it supports all wildland firefighting, from aviation, from the planes to the ground, to the people that work and wash our clothes. So it covers a pretty broad field of individuals, to the people, even to the folks that cook our food. They cover. They're the first responders. If there's an incident, you can call them up. They'll send the guy down. He'll make sure, that the bills are going to get paid. And it's a nonprofit, is what it is. There's a good YouTube on it. They always try to promote. Coors was a sponsor for them. They put a nice little video out of what they actually do. But mainly they are, because the government's really not really quick on, monetary coverage when, the primary householder can't make any money. So they make sure they get their contacts in. We had an individual at my jump base that had passed, and his dad is very, very involved with it. It kind of keeps his son's memory alive, and it keeps him feeling like he's still part of the community. So he's a big promoter of the Wildland Firefighting Foundation. They have bass tournaments. They do all this stuff.
Is it an international group?
Is it internet? I don't know if it's international. I've only known about here. Oh no, yeah, actually,
international. I meant all over the U.S. My apologies. I meant all over the U.S. And then my initial thought was, is the charity that we're signing up for, is that one going all over the area, or is that for a specific region or district?
The whole country.
Yeah.
Internationally, they do Canada, because I know that they did post some stuff about the Gallup and those folks in Canada last year. I don't know if they were involved because I didn't research it, but there were some fatalities up there with their big fires.
Oh, wow.
And they let that be known that that's happening there as well. So it's not just here. But it's a great foundation. I should support it more. I feel guilty for not, but
well, you can buy a bag of coffee when we get it up.
Perfect. Yeah.
So what we're going to do is we're going to set it up so that every bag of coffee that is purchased, the profit of it after cost is going to be getting donated to the organization. So when that bag comes out, when we work out all the details and we release the bag, we're going to try to get it out as much as possible. But a lot of that getting out is also going to fall on the Trinity Hotshot group to get it out. But since we're supporting it, we want to make sure we get it out as much as possible too.
I'm stoked. It's a good group of boys. So cool. Well, thank you guys. Until next time.